Hello and welcome everybody to H639. And today I would like to address something very interesting, and that's the tricky nature of the reflective consciousness. We learned about the reflective consciousness from the article by Carl Pribram, who also spoke about Henri Bergson and his marvelous world. But the reason for talking about the tricky reflective consciousness is that to point to the necessity of both an explicit and an implicit knowledge to understand anything. And the simplistic explanation could be, we need to understand not only what a person says, but also why that person is saying it. The reason, the meaning. One can see that the said is very simplistic as a token, and that the token is always used in a specific purpose according to circumstance. So instead of equaling a word to meaning, we have to see who said it, why that person said it, and in what circumstances. Without that, according to quantum physics and according to the uncertainty principle coming from Gödel, Heisenberg and so forth, shows that it's impossible to know anything. The first example is that the reflective consciousness is not really aware, but that doesn't mean it's not complicated. And it doesn't mean that it's easy to disclose its purpose. An example that's quite common, and we have as an example that we mentioned earlier at various times, is that a lot of people say that they believe in morality, that something is right and that something is wrong. But when you go to the Milgram experiment, it shows that it's not at all that simple. And I would like to propose something that we all learned from Gödel, and that is simply not enough with the representation, i.e. the explicit. But we need to watch its use and see its use clear and ambiguous. To understand its use clear and unambiguous, we need the meaning. We need the body. It's not enough, as Putnam believed, to have a brain in a vat. Or more or less, I'd say that what Descartes meant as well. Well, at least in the common notion of Descartes. Another way of taking this is to look at the reflective consciousness in itself. It's doing its play automatic. Its intention, planning, and therefore it could be very, very hard to conceive of the actual direction. Especially when there is not much intention going on from the reflective consciousness. It's because of its automatic nature and its confused state. The reflective consciousness is most often confusing word and object, making a distinction in between them that makes it very easy to confuse them. One example could be our own congregation. They all went to the catacomb for different reasons. Now I'd say a person like Folke only participated for the wish of activity or social comfort. And the reason this lady E was there was for the reason that her reflective consciousness really wanted there to be something other than this world, something of overworldly or beyond this, an eternal soul, a God. But obviously she didn't implicitly believe. It was nothing in her body. Her body was all the implicit movement in society. It's very, very hard to resist this flow. It's almost like a tremendous river, like the Niagara Falls. Once you're in, how can you swim up the stream? And this is one of the information one gets from Bohm, is to understand that there is an implicit force working in society, in the language game, in our life world, as Wittgenstein would call it. And meaning is external, and that means that we have to adjust to that meaning, or that meaning is what's needed to communicate. It might seem, and that's a very easy trap to fall in, that meaning, that explicit wording in the society is precise, determined. But still, who doesn't fall into that trap? I think very few people can escape it. You have to be born outside society, outside the language world, and then possibly you wouldn't have even a functioning language. And what Bohm is saying is that the explicit, how telling it might be, it needs the implicit. And this is very interesting. The Zeitgeist, or the Das Man of now, it's incredibly forceful. It decides what can be said, how it can be said, and why it could be said. No one is an island. And this is something that Paul Feyerabend pointed out, that there is an illogic, especially to the analytical philosophers. They sort of isolate meaning and reference and all those things from each other. They don't want them to be interconnected because that's sloppy or messy. It takes a lot of work. It's so much easier, for instance, to have a mathematics that doesn't take reality into account. And I think that's laziness, and that's our worldliness is the reason that 95% of all mathematicians today has completely ignored the discoveries from Gödel. And those are logical discoveries. It's not something that can be ignored, really. You can't look aside from them. They are pretty much definitive. But that goes to show the human ability to always ignore something. And oddly enough, I'd say that's the reflective consciousness being at work. It's a marvel at ignoring things. It doesn't matter how obvious it is, it can always be ignored. And I think that goes incredibly much for what Gödel discovered. Incompleteness seemed to be unheard of among mathematicians, logicians, and they always find a roundabout that says that's not the final word in this matter. Well, it is the final word, something that Gödel deeply realized. There can be no more, as he said. I think one can make this a bit more clear by saying, what does it mean to believe that the explicit is the same, I put the same in quotation mark, as the implicit? Because that is something that in itself takes the belief of sameness. A sameness that does not or is not allowed in the language game. And why is that? Well, we can't say that the word same or the meaning of the same or the use of the same can be something that is above or underneath the language game and sort of rules how we use words and rules the relationship between words or objects. Same does not have a prioritized function. It can be used when you talk. If you meet somebody, look, you bought the same car as you did before. That makes sense. But to say that the implicit is the same as the explicit doesn't make any sense. That's the wrong use of sameness. And it's especially wrong to just think it. And when you think that, what do you think? Well, it's just a model thinking. You can't think that. You can break many rules, but you can't break the rules of the language game. It's completely impossible. The only thing you do is not making sense. And although you can meet other people who are not making sense, then you get a feeling from the reflective consciousness that you together are mentioning the same meaning. You are most definitely not. That is and will always remain a sort of misuse, to use an Alexandrian term, or as Wittgenstein would say, a misunderstanding of the nature of reality. But I would say that there is a flip side to all this, something positive. And now I'm turning the tables quite a lot. So do pay attention, because now it's becoming difficult. In a way, Gödel's incompleteness, Wittgenstein's language games, they show that there actually are such a thing that they do not really believe, I'd say. But that the thing that actually exists is a partly independent reality, or a relative independence, as much as it can be. And although at the beginning this seemed to be a sort of compromise, or not as much as you get from classical physics, where you claim that there is a complete independency, that words can signify whatever they want and the world is somewhere else. So I would say that the project of classical physics has failed. It doesn't work according to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And of course according to quantum physics as well. And it showed we have come to understand that classical physics is a misuse of the language game. And I'd say, in reality, classical physics is nothing but this relativity, this postmodernist relativity that we feel we're living in now. The zeitgeist, at least since the 80s. So by claiming the separatedness between word and reality, between mind and body and so forth, the claim that classical physics make themselves doesn't hold. It's not enough to wish there to be two sides of reality that are independent. It will not have an effect. Instead, what they're saying, everything is relative. And whereas relativity is impossible as well, what they're really saying is confused talking. It cannot be understood in any way. Yes, you can repeat the words, and many people have done that. You can write books about it, but it doesn't have a meaning. It's a complete break with the language game, and therefore we end up in relativity. And instead of relativity being, as its motto usually is, anything goes, there are different truths, it's just confusion. Nothing but confusion. This could be likened to a person that buys a bow and arrow in order to shoot a deer. I just saw some deers here earlier on. So let's say he misunderstood how the bow and arrow works. He's unskilled. He's lacking proficiency in handling the bow and arrow. He will not shoot at the deer. So the intended goal will not be satisfied. He will, although he will still cause something, he will cause some sort of disorder. And that's the effect of classical physics. That's the only effect. It's disorder. It's lack of energy because of this disorder. It's lack of direction. The arrow doesn't hit the deer. Project is not finished. There is no success. This is what relativity is. And here you see classical physics and relativity amounts to more or less very similar things. So what we think is relativity is just a state of disorder, and especially a state of disorder who in the person who's handling the bow and arrow. The confusion in Putnam, the confusion in John Searle, lies not so much in what they're saying to people as what's happening with themselves. They don't know how to manage themselves. They do not know how to manage their own thinking process. And the disorder, the unordered state, can in some way be transferred. It has an effect. It doesn't have a projected effect. It doesn't have a desired effect. It's not a strong effect, but it's more sort of a friction. It's messy. Unclear thinking, as Alexander would say. And that typically is unclear thinking. And I think soon we need to be very, very specific about this and not luring people, tricking people into believing that classical physics is wrong, but it somehow makes sense. It does not make sense. That's the main problem. How could it make sense? It didn't make sense from the beginning. It didn't make sense even to Newton. It cannot ever, never make any sense to anyone. That's the deepest structure in classical physics. It doesn't make any sense. And as such, it has an effect. An effect of causing friction in the world. An effect of causing lack of knowledge. And I'd say this is this lack of knowledge, this friction, this lack of energy, direction, that is the zeitgeist of today. That is the implicit knowledge. That's what we all feel. And we want to give it a name, and we call it relativity. But it's not truly relativity. Some things are relative, but this one isn't. Relative isn't that bad, actually. It has to do with how you relate something to something else. And people tend to think that's something bad because you don't have an absolute origin. There's no inert place in the universe where you can start from. There's no origin. And people often perceive that as something negative. Oh my God. Actually, it would be a disaster for the world if that would exist. But the thing is, we can't understand what that would be. It's impossible to think. And to be absolutely honest, the criticism for Leibniz is that Newton's physics didn't make any sense. It's not that he didn't like it. He did tell Clarke, please do explain. What do you mean? Can you explicate? Can you further the argument? And what happened? Nothing. Of course nothing. It couldn't be anything. So this is a good point, because there is a partly independent reality. And here we can make an easy message, although simplified. An escape out of relativity. It wouldn't be absolutely correct to say that, but that's what it is. Although relativity never existed. And thinking of this, because this is how Wittgenstein show the way out of the bottle for the fly. And the fly is us. And our understanding of Wittgenstein is the flying out of the bottle. And we see here now, it's a very big shame that poor old Bohr, Bohm I'd say, never understood that. That's what we learned from the book we mentioned of David Pete. And I'm quite certain that that knowledge would have saved Bohm. It would have saved him from all those years of depression, of all those years of bad mood, lack of direction, lack of meaning in life, and all that. It was the sheer confusion. And he tried to solve it, and I think he did an extraordinary job. But one thing was lacking. And what we need is to continue the legacy of Bohm and add the knowledge from philosophical investigations to make his amazing theory whole, and honor his memory by letting this improved holographic theory be known to the world. A much needed contemporary thing for society of today, because we are suffering badly from relativity. And one very famous person today, Jordan Peterson, has said relativity is the enemy of modern society. And he started a crusade against relativity, the postmodernist that he thinks it. But I think that's barking up the wrong tree. The problem is not that the world is relative. It's our belief in classical physics, or our accepting of some of the tenets of classical physics. And one of those are, without a doubt, the division between word and object. And I think poor old Jordan Peterson need to learn that as well, because that would have saved him, and will save him in the future, heck of a lot of trouble, because there's no need to attack any relativist. Relativism is not something that's spreading by certain persons. They're not trolls lurking by and spreading that everything in the world is relative. Yes, maybe they cause some confusion, but that's all they can do. They can't change the language game. How would that happen? You can't be outside the language game. It's as indestructible as a strange attractor. What, it doesn't even make sense to say that the language game will be destructed. How? Where? By whom? No, what we need is a healing power. Take away the tenets of classical physics. Look through them carefully. Enlighten every bit and piece what is saying. And you will find darkened spots. Spots that not been observed by knowledge. Make those spots knowledgeable. And it's not a castle that's falling. It's not a card made of a house made of cards. You will see it was all an illusion from the beginning. It will start to be transparent. And this transparency means that both the world and you are healing simultaneously. It's not a one-sided thing. It's not only the world that's healing or some theory. It's healing together. And I think together with the insight from philosophical investigation, the Bohmian ideology is bound to succeed. It's bound to heal the world. And it's time to take up the banner and do another type of crusade than the one that Jordan Peterson is trying. This is a crusade of knowledge to inform, because it's only knowledge that can set you free. Only knowledge and nothing but knowledge. I say thank you.